How y'all doing? My name is Gable Roubideaux. I'm a part of the Indigenous Justice Initiative at Haskell Indian Nations University. What we are is basically, right now, we're four people who are trying to find a way to make these tribal codes or rules or whatever you would like to call them, to make them applicable in a court of law, to make them enforceable in a court of law. And how we started is, well, I found out about it in an Indigenous philosophy class. I took a class that was taught by Dr. Wildcat, and one day he just had a crazy idea and threw it out there, and me and a couple other students grabbed it and ran with it. And Shane ended up coming into it about a month later. He popped up to one of our first meetings with a good friend of the group's, Alex Rodriguez. And ever since then, we've been working and trying to build up this working tribunal or this working indigenous court to where we could be able to not only critique the United States government, but also provide an alternative with that as well. We just recently had our first real big event that we felt was large enough that we have recordings and we've saved it. We were lucky enough to have David Wilkins and Cornell Peabody to be able to be there, as well as Arnold Palmer, a member of the Dene Nation. I think that some of the things that we're doing they're interesting, but they're also scary in a sense. We talked about the Jay Treaty earlier and concepts of borders. I was reading a book by a First Nations lady named Leanne Simpson. And in her book, she says that in relation to fishing and hunting rights, that part of the reason that we have those rights is because we forced the government, the colonial governments, to grant these rights in their own court system. But another part of it is because these fishing and treaty rights, they're not a threat to the colonial society anymore. And I believe that when we start talking about things like indigenous justice as a means of opposing criminal justice, or the imagination or the imaginary thing that is a border, we threaten that colonial society, and we are gonna get pushback from that. And a lot of the things that we're coming to figure out is that stuff that we're talking about probably isn't gonna be enforceable in a court system. But one thing that doesn't really matter is that, well, maybe one thing that does matter is the fact that we're re-articulating the argument of our ancestors. We're not denying, we're not trying to change anything. As Leanne Simpson said, we're doing as we have always done. And to kind of transition into my work with the group, I focus more so on critiquing the American government, critiquing the criminal justice system. And one of the ways I did this was I talk about the purpose of a government. What is the government supposed to do? Well, if you listen to John Locke, old English or European philosopher, he says that the purpose of government is protection of property, essentially. However, there's another guy out there named Jean-Jacques Rousseau who said that the creation of inequality was the creation of private property. And if you take those two ideas and you kind of mesh them together, then you have an understanding that the whole purpose of government is the maintenance of inequality. And that system, a system that is designed to maintain inequality, is its antithesis to what indigenous people believe in a general notion and to what my people, the Comanche people, believe wholly. The next thing that we kind of talked about is the powers of the Constitution. Not necessarily in the sense of what it can do, but what it's not supposed to do. One of the things that people think about when they think about the Constitution is human rights. We think about the amendments, the right to free speech, the right to bear arms. We think about these as God-given rights. In the Declaration of Independence, it states all men are equal. Not all American citizens, not all people in America all men are equal. However, when we look at how the Constitution is applied, if you're not a citizen of the United States, they can easily say, oh, well, this doesn't apply to you, as we've seen with the Dreamers, or with the travel bans in Iraq, or with our own people. To have an understanding of the Constitution to where it applies only to citizenship gives the Constitution a power that it was never intended to have, and that is the power to decide who and what is human. And another thing that we kind of talked about, this is a cohort of mine that I worked closely with named Andy Weber, and we kind of developed the concept of moral economic systems. And what a moral economic system is essentially, it's a social construct that's designed to maintain an economy and control behavior at the same time. And Andy focused primarily on the doctrine of discovery because, as we all know, the doctrine of discovery had a lot to do with the character and the Christian character of the indigenous peoples who were encountered. And these moral economic systems were basically, I want to just draw one real quick, and this was the Roman Pontifex, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And basically what that did is it granted Portugal from, I believe, Pope Alexander V, if I'm not mistaken. It granted Portugal exclusive right to colonize Africa. The entirety of Africa, they got an economic base the size of a continent. And they did this based on the character of the indigenous Africans. And so we talk a lot about discovery and what we wanted to do, and David Wilkins could probably speak about discovery way longer than I could, and I feel kind of embarrassed trying to talk to him about discovery, but the thing about it is it repeats itself. Like we see it in gentrification. People say gentrification is the new colonialism. No, it's just another moral economic system. It's not a repetition of colonialism. It's the same system applied in a different way. And I think that's what I'm kind of coming to understand is that colonialism, there are different forms of it. We have classical colonialism, which is kind of Europe sending dudes to Africa or America or wherever, extracting resources and then taking it back to the motherland. And then we have settler colonialism. And the main difference between settler colonialism and classical colonialism is settler colonialism has this process, as described by Leanne Simpson, of erasing indigenous people from the land and then securing that land for settlers. Right now, we're not dealing with British. We're not dealing with France. We're not dealing with Spain. We're talking about America. We're talking about Canada, Mexico. These are settler colonial governments because they're ingrained in our territory. And they're, I read a book called American Permanento, and what a permanento is it's a mistake in a painting that you can notice, and it's very subtle and it's very hard to tell, but you can see it kind of where the artist messed up. That's what I see indigenous people as. We are the permanento. We are what's under that, and we have a political system that's impressed on top of us that we can't really see ourselves necessarily. And one more thing I'd like to say is that throughout my research, I came across a quote that kind of stuck with me, that kind of, it wouldn't let me go, and that is, decolonization implicates us all. So when we talk about justice, we're not talking about going over and getting America to do this or that. We need to look at ourselves too, and how we are implicit in these systems. And I think a big part of this is the difference between classical and settler colonialism. Like, are we necessarily understanding that we contribute to the same systems that oppressed our ancestors by by attempting to perpetuate the capitalist economy. Like, are these things that we're continuing to do? And I think with our group that we want to provide a way through the legal system that isn't necessarily destructive to our people, that's not gonna force on us inequality, that's not gonna force on us an idea of humanity that's structured by the Constitution, and that's not gonna force on us a moral economic system. We want this idea of justice that allows us to be who we are.
Is that over there?